They said I was overreacting. But imagine reading a text from your own mother that said, "Don't come home for Christmas. You make Ryan look bad." I didn't respond. I didn't explain. Instead, I froze every cent they depended on, pulled my investment from their business, and watched the family empire collapse from the comfort of my quiet apartment. A week later, they begged, cried, blamed. But it was too late. I'm Madison Carter, and this is how silence became my favorite form of revenge. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, don't forget to hit subscribe, smash like button, and tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from. The morning light poured through the big windows of my apartment in Santa Barbara, cutting through the soft gold of the Christmas tree lights. I had the radio on low, a slow jazz version of "Have Yourself a Merry Little Christmas" playing while I wrapped the last of the gifts. Paper, crinkled tape, clicked, ribbon curled. Everything around me looked like the front page of a lifestyle magazine. Neat, glowing, controlled. That's how I liked it. On the kitchen counter sat a folder, receipts from the caterer I'd hired for my parents' Christmas dinner, the florist who'd delivered the poinsettias, the baker who'd made the triple-layer cake my mother loved. It was supposed to be my surprise for them. I'd told the vendors to bill me directly. It felt good doing things that made them happy. Or at least it used to. My phone buzzed on the counter. I smiled automatically, wiping a bit of tape glue off my fingers before picking it up. The screen lit up Mom. "Don't come for Christmas this year. Sabrina feels uncomfortable when you're around. Let's just keep things peaceful." I stared. 5 words, no punctuation, no emotion. "You're not coming this year. Sabrina isn't comfortable. Let's keep things peaceful." I read it once, then twice, then again, waiting for the rest to appear. Something like, "We'll celebrate another day," or "We love you, sweetheart." Nothing came. Just the blinking cursor of a conversation that suddenly didn't exist anymore. Another text popped up. "Ryan, you always have to be the center of attention, don't you?" I froze, the phone heavy in my hand. The Christmas lights reflected on the black screen, tiny blinking colors, in a world that suddenly felt very gray. There was a long minute where I just listened to the ticking clock, the faint hum of the refrigerator, the sound of wrapping paper rustling against the table. Last year came back in flashes. Sabrina laughing too loud, Ryan talking about his new business idea, my mother hovering over him fussing like he was still 10, and me, standing by the sink scraping gravy from plates while the dishwasher hummed behind me. I remembered looking up and seeing them through the dining room glass. They looked like a picture-perfect family, and I wasn't in the frame. I set the phone down face up on the counter. The message still glowed. My heartbeat slowed, then steadied. "There are sentences that don't need punctuation," I said under my breath, because they already end something. The radio flipped to another song. Outside, someone's kid laughed, a car honked. Life went on. I picked up the phone again, looked at the messages once more, and felt something inside me settle. Not breaking, not bursting, just settling. I deleted both texts. Then, almost mechanically, I held the power button until the screen went black. Silence. The kind that doesn't ache anymore. My laptop screen glowed from the dining table. The email confirmation from the bank was still open. Transfer completed. 150,000 wired to Carter's roastery operating account. The timestamp 3 hours ago. I'd sent the money to save their cafe. Again. I walked over, staring at the line of text. The zeros looked like a string of little holes punched through me. Last week, Mom had called crying about bills, about how they were so close to losing everything. She'd said, "Ryan's working so hard, honey. We just need a little help." I hadn't hesitated. I'd wired the money the next morning, telling myself this was the last time. It never was. Now, standing there in the quiet glow of my Christmas lights, I laughed. Sharp, breathless, humorless. "I just bought the dinner I'm not invited to," I said out loud. The sound startled me, bouncing back from the walls. I picked up the receipts again, stared at the total, $2, $460 for catering, $450 for decor, $150 for custom centerpieces. I thought of the way my mom would post pictures later, tagging Sabrina, calling her the sweetest part of our Christmas. Not me. Never me. I sat down at the edge of the couch, the faint scent of pine in the air, and folded my hands together. My fingertips felt cold. If family was supposed to be an investment, I thought then I'd been making payments my whole life. and the interest was heartbreak. Outside church bells began to ring slow and distant. I watched the reflection of the tree lights dance across the floor, took a deep breath, and whispered, "Merry Christmas, Mom. You got your piece." Then I closed the laptop. The room dimmed, leaving only the flicker of the lights. The quiet didn't feel heavy this time. It felt earned. When I was 15, my mother used to say I was too grown for my own good. What she really meant was that I wasn't needy enough to be noticed. I remember the smell of burnt toast and cheap perfume drifting through our kitchen in Santa Barbara, the morning sun cutting across the counter as I poured cereal for Ryan. He was 9 then. Loud, restless, always running late. Mom would rush past us, heels clacking, kissing his head, never mine. "Don't forget his soccer gear," she'd say, grabbing her coffee. "He's got potential, Maddie. We can't let him waste it. Potential." That word followed him like a halo. Ryan would grin, cheeks stuffed with cereal milk dribbling down his chin. "I'm gonna win today, Mom." "You always do, sweetheart," she'd laugh, pressing his face between her palms. Then she'd glance at me. "You'll watch him after school, right?" I'd nod. "Of course. No thanks. No kiss. Just expectation." I learned early that in our house, love was conditional. Something you earned, not something you were born with. By the time I was 18, I'd had enough of being invisible. I got a scholarship to UCLA and packed my bags before anyone could talk me out of it. I didn't even wait for Dad to get home from work. When I hugged my mom goodbye, she said, "I'm proud of you, Madison. Now maybe I can finally focus on Ryan's future." That was it. No tears, no "I'll miss you," just relief. The first year in Los Angeles was hard. I worked 2 jobs, waitressing at night, interning during the day, and studied until sunrise. I paid my own rent, learned how to change a tire, filed my taxes wrong twice, and still managed to keep my scholarship. Every call home was the same. "How's Ryan?" I'd ask. "Oh, you know, still figuring things out." Mom would say, "He's trying a new business idea, an app this time. We're so excited for him." "That's great." I'd reply even when I could hear the silence that followed. No one asked about me. Years blurred together. I graduated, climbed the corporate ladder, built a name for myself in marketing. Luxform, the luxury fashion brand, hired me when I was 29. By 32, I was their youngest strategy director. I thought that maybe, just maybe, they'd finally see me. Then came the call. Mom's voice was trembling. "Honey, it's the cafe. The bills. We're drowning. Your father can't keep up with the mortgage, and Ryan's projects haven't taken off yet. You know how hard he's trying." Of course she called me, not him. I was sitting in my office overlooking downtown LA, still in heels from a 12-hour day. I could see my reflection in the glass, tired, polished, efficient. "How much do you need?" I asked. There was a pause. "About 150,000, she said softly, like if she whispered it, it wouldn't sound as obscene as it was. I wired it the next morning. No contract, no signature, just a note for Carter's Roastery, 45% equity. Keep your dream alive. 2 days later. Mom called again, but her tone had changed. "You know, sweetheart, family shouldn't talk about money. It's not right to make things so formal." I smiled even though she couldn't see me. "It's not about formality, Mom. It's about fairness." She hesitated. "You've always been so serious, Madison. Can't you just help without making it complicated?" "I am helping," I said quietly. "You're just not used to it coming with accountability." Silence. Then she changed the subject to Ryan's new idea, a podcast about motivation. Months passed. I didn't ask about the money. I knew I wouldn't get updates. I didn't want to. But that winter they invited me to dinner. I'd paid off their second mortgage that year, and maybe guilt made them generous. I drove down to Santa Barbara, brought wine, and wore a red dress I'd bought on sale but pretended was designer. The house looked the same, walls covered with Ryan's photos, his trophies from high school. Soccer still polished the framed article about his entrepreneurial journey on the hallway wall. Nothing of mine. Dinner was roast chicken and mashed potatoes, the same as always. Ryan talked nonstop about his next business. An eco-friendly coffee subscription box? Mom beamed. "Isn't he clever?" "Maddie." I nodded, sipping wine. "Sure. Sounds ambitious." Sabrina, sitting beside him, giggled. "He's got such a creative mind. I couldn't keep up even if I tried." "Don't worry," I said lightly. "Neither can his investors." The table went silent. Ryan shot me a look. Mom cleared her throat. "You should learn to laugh more," she said finally. "You're too stiff sometimes. You should smile like Sabrina does." It lights up the whole room. I smiled then, wide enough to hurt. They thought it was compliance. They didn't know it was exhaustion. Later that night, I drove back to LA with the windows down and the cold air slicing through my hair. The road was empty, the ocean to my right, dark and endless. I kept thinking about how easy it was for them to admire people who hadn't done the work. They never saw me as the daughter who made it. They saw me as the safety net that kept their dream from hitting the ground. And even then, they never said thank you. By the time I pulled into my apartment garage, I already knew something fundamental had broken. It wasn't sudden. It had been cracking for years. That dinner had just made the sound loud enough for me to finally hear it. The bell above the cafe door jingled as I stepped inside Carter's roastery. The place smelled the same. Coffee beans, vanilla syrup, and something faintly burnt. It looked warm, inviting, almost perfect, until you looked closer. The paint was chipped near the counter, and the espresso machine hissed like it was breathing through a broken lung. Still, the wall behind the register gleamed with framed photos of Ryan, shaking hands with local officials standing under a banner that read, "Young Entrepreneur of the Year." His smile stretched wide, confident, rehearsed. He wasn't behind the counter. Sabrina was. She stood near the window, one hand holding a cappuccino, the other snapping pictures with her phone. "Handmade coffee, real love," she said sweetly, typing the caption. #support local. Ryan came out from the back room wiping his hands on a towel. "Maddie, didn't expect you today. I was in the neighborhood," I lied, setting my bag on the counter. "Thought I'd check on the numbers." Sabrina looked up from her phone, her smile polite but tight. "Everything's fine. We're doing great." "I'm sure you are," I said, flipping through the ledger. "But the supplier invoices look high for November." Ryan's voice rose half an octave. "We upgraded to organic beans. It's what customers want now." "Right." I tapped the paper. "You might want to make sure you're not paying twice for the same shipment." Sabrina leaned against the counter, her tone syrupy. "We believe in energy, not pressure. Not everything has to scale like a corporation." I looked up and smiled, soft but sharp. "Energy doesn't pay invoices, Sabrina." The air thinned. Ryan cleared his throat, forcing a laugh. "She's just sharing her perspective, Maddie. Don't make it sound like a board meeting." I closed the ledger. Then maybe she shouldn't talk like a motivational speaker. Ryan's eyes hardened. "You know not everything needs your approval." "I'm aware," I said. "But if you'd like my money to stay in this business, it could use my oversight." The sentence hung in the air like smoke. Sabrina's cheeks flushed pink. I could see the reflection of the open sign flickering in the window behind her. Half of the lights burned out. I grabbed my bag. "Keep the receipts organized. I'll call next week." As I walked out, I heard Sabrina whisper to Ryan, "She doesn't even try to hide it. She thinks she's better than us." Outside, the cold air hit my face like a wake-up slap. The street glittered with Christmas lights, children dragging their parents toward the ice cream stand across the street. Inside, behind the window, Sabrina posed again for her camera. Ryan smiled like he hadn't heard a thing. That night, my phone rang while I was pouring myself a drink. "Mom." "Hi, sweetheart," she started. "I heard you stopped by the cafe today." I set the glass down. "I did. Is there a problem?" There was a pause long enough to hear her inhale. "You could try being a little gentler. Sabrina said you made her uncomfortable. She's sensitive, you know." "She's 30, I said flatly. "She feels like you look down on her." I said, "I just don't pretend to be impressed." Mom sighed. "She said you made her feel small." I leaned against the counter, closing my eyes. No one can make someone small unless they're already trying to shrink. Another pause. Then a quiet, "You always have to get the last word, don't you?" Click. She hung up. The whiskey burned going down. I stared at my reflection in the dark window. I didn't look angry, just tired. The next day, a friend from work sent me a screenshot. Sabrina's latest Instagram story. Some people don't know how to share the spotlight. Maybe they're afraid they'll stop being seen. She'd tagged the location, Carter's Roastery, and used a soft filter that made everything glow. I looked at it for a long time. Then I put the phone face down on the table and went back to work. By the time evening rolled in, Santa Barbara was covered in strings of gold lights. I could see the same glow from my apartment window in Los Angeles. I thought of the cafe again, its mismatched chairs, the hum of the espresso machine, the photo of Ryan shaking hands with the mayor. Then my phone buzzed again. Mom, this time with a single message, "Don't come to Christmas this year. Sabrina needs peace." I read it once. The words didn't sting this time. They just landed and stayed there, heavy but familiar. I set the phone down on the table beside the empty glass. Outside, the city twinkled. In Mar, I could still smell the whiskey and pine. Somewhere between those two scents, something in me went still. The kind of stillness that doesn't mean calm. It means deciding you're done, pretending you're welcome where you're not. The conference room smelled faintly of coffee and lemon cleaner. Luxform liked everything bright. White walls, glass tables, chrome accents that made the room hum with a kind of polished silence. I stood at the head of the table, laser pointer in hand, walking the team through the spring campaign. Models in soft neutrals flashed across the screen behind me, the tagline, bold and simple, less noise, more you. When the presentation ended, there was polite applause, the kind that fills space without meaning much. My boss, Evelyn Clark, nodded from the far end of the table. She was in her late 40s, graceful but sharp, a woman who could end a meeting with one raised eyebrow. "Excellent work, Madison," she said. "Stay behind for a second, will you?" The others filtered out, murmuring compliments and checking their phones. I turned off the projector, my reflection briefly flickering across the blank screen. When it was just the two of us, Evelyn folded her hands and gave me the kind of look that said she wasn't here to praise me. "Madison." She started carefully. "I saw something on social media today. Your brother's post. It's circulating." I felt my stomach tighten, though my face stayed still. "What post?" She sighed, almost apologetic. "He made a comment about family money, something about being sabotaged. A few of our clients have brought it up. They're curious if there's drama." I inhaled slowly, trying not to laugh. "Of course they are." Evelyn leaned forward. "Look, I know families are complicated, but in this business, image is part of the product. And your name is attached to ours." I met her eyes. "Are you asking if I did anything wrong?" "No," she said softly. "I'm asking if you're prepared for people assuming you did." For a second, the hum of the air conditioner was the only sound in the room. "I can't apologize," I said finally, for something I didn't do. Evelyn's gaze softened. "I know. Just be careful. People love a good scandal more than a good story." I nodded, gathering my things. My hands were steady, but my pulse wasn't. As I walked out of the office, the afternoon sun spilled through the glass walls, slicing everything into fragments of light. People wanted women like me to be steady, graceful, forgiving. They wanted smiles that didn't waver even when someone twisted the knife. They never wanted to see the moment you stopped bleeding. By the time evening came, the city had already blurred into its usual rhythm. Traffic hums, sirens, somewhere in the distance, the low chatter of people chasing something they couldn't name. Olivia met me at our usual spot by the beach, a quiet bar that smelled like salt and whiskey. She was already there when I arrived, blonde hair tied up, a glass of red wine half empty in front of her. "You look like you've been through a week in one day," she said. "Close enough," I answered, sitting across from her. The bartender set down a gin and tonic without me having to ask. Olivia leaned forward, resting her chin on her hand. "You talked to your family yet?" I let out a short laugh. "You mean the people who disinvited me from Christmas? No. I figured I'd give them the peace they wanted." She raised an eyebrow. "You're not going home?" "No," I said simply. "I've given them enough reasons to forget I exist." For a while we drank in silence, watching the waves crash beyond the window. "You don't worry they'll think you're being cruel?" she asked finally. I looked down at the condensation sliding down my glass. "They already do. The difference is, now I'm fine with it." Olivia smiled sadly. "You've changed. I had to." I said, "They taught me how." She reached across the table, touching my hand lightly. "So what now?" I finished my drink. "Now I stop paying for their comfort." Her brows furrowed. "You mean, I've bought their silence for years, Liv. Mortgage payments, bailouts, birthday dinners they forgot were mine. $150,000 to save a business I don't even drink coffee from. I think it's time I buy something for myself." She tilted her head. "Like what peace?" I said. We sat quietly after that, the kind of silence that didn't need filling. When I got home, the apartment was dark except for the faint glow of the city through the blinds. I poured another drink, kicked off my heels, and stood in front of the framed photo on my console table. Our family Christmas from years ago. Mom, Dad, Ryan, Sabrina. Me at the end of the couch, half-cropped by the camera's frame. I picked it up, traced the edge of the photo with my thumb, then set it face down. The laptop waited on my desk, its screen lighting the room as I sat down. My cursor blinked over the login to Carter's Roastery's business account. I hadn't checked the books in weeks. When the dashboard loaded, the numbers jumped out immediately. Expenses up, profits down, new vendor names I didn't recognize. Transactions labeled consulting, marketing, retainer, promotional partnerships. I scrolled slower. The math didn't add up. I leaned back, watching the rows of figures pulse faintly on the screen. Something inside me shifted, precise and quiet. A slow smile found its way to my lips. Not joy, not satisfaction, just clarity. "All right," I whispered to the empty room. "It's time." The numbers stared back at me from the screen like bruises, fresh, dark, undeniable. Multiple transactions all labeled the same way: Hale Consulting, Marketing, Retainer, Community Partnerships. The totals stacked up neatly, $45,000 gone, in less than 3 months. There was no Hale Consulting in any of our approved vendor lists. I checked twice. Then again, each transfer ended up in the same account, one tied to a personal debit card in Santa Barbara. I didn't need to guess whose. I stared at the line item, letting the anger settle instead of explode. I'd learned to be quiet in my fury. It scared people more that way. By the time I closed my laptop, the decision was already made. The next morning, I met Daniel Myers at a small cafe in Westwood. It was early, and the city hadn't fully woken up yet, just the hum of espresso machines and the clinking of mugs. Daniel was already there, sitting at a corner table with his usual black coffee and the same expression he'd had since college, calm, calculating, almost too steady. He stood as I approached. "You look like someone who hasn't slept." "I didn't," I said, sitting down. "You'll see why." I slid my laptop across the table and pulled up the transaction history. He scrolled, his eyes narrowing. "Hale Consulting." He read aloud. "Never heard of them. Neither have I said. "But apparently they've been doing a lot of work for my family's cafe." He looked up, jaw tightening. "Do you think it's him?" "I don't think," I said. "I know." Daniel leaned back, steepling his fingers. "All right, what do you want to do?" "Check everything I said. Every invoice, every transfer. If there's fraud, I want it on paper. If there's theft, I want it recorded. And if it's exactly what I think it is, I'm done. I'm pulling out legally." He studied me. "That's not a small move, Maddie. You're not just walking away. You're detonating the bridge. I know. You're ready for that kind of fallout." I met his gaze. I've been living with the fallout of their choices my whole life. I'm just switching sides. He nodded slowly, as if measuring my words. "Give me a few days. I'll need access to the company account and your ownership documents. I'll send them by noon," I said. When I left the cafe, the morning had turned sharp and bright. The sun hit the buildings hard, too clean for the mood I was in. I walked for a while before getting into my car, the cold air slicing through my coat. That night, I sat on my couch laptop, open, fingers tracing over the trackpad, but not clicking anything. My inbox was quiet, my phone quieter. I could almost hear the echo of my mother's voice, the way she always sounded so soft when she was being cruel. "You know how hard Ryan tries." I took a slow breath. He tried, yes, tried to build, failed, and used my name to clean up after him. That wasn't trying. That was taking. 3 days later, Daniel's name popped up in my inbox. The subject line was short confirmation. My chest went still before I even clicked it. He's been transferring money from the business account into a personal one since July. The account belongs to him. I've attached documentation. Recommend initiating withdrawal of funds and notifying the bank. I scrolled through the PDFs, wire transfer statements, account numbers. His name, again and again. Ryan. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling, exhaling slowly. The rage didn't come. It was something else instead. Clarity, maybe. Or closure. I picked up my phone and called Daniel. He answered on the first ring. "You saw it." "I did," I said. "Let's start the withdrawal process." "Okay," he said carefully. "You're sure?" "I'm sure," I said. "I want them to understand what it feels like when something they rely on disappears without warning." He paused. "You're calm." "I'm done screaming," I said. "They didn't listen when I talked. Maybe they'll hear silence." After we hung up, I opened my laptop again. The bank's online portal was bright against the dim room. The cursor blinked beside the option, Initiate Capital Withdrawal. For a moment, I hesitated, not because of guilt, but because of the finality of it. Once I clicked, there would be no going back. Then I remembered Christmas, Mom's text, Ryan's sneer, Sabrina's smug little smile. I pressed enter. A small confirmation window appeared. "Funds will be frozen during review." Proceed. Yes, I whispered and clicked again. There was no sound, no dramatic flash, just the quiet click of a key that changed everything. I sat there for a long time afterward, watching the progress bar crawl across the screen. When it was done, I closed the laptop and let the room go dark again. I thought revenge would feel like fire, but it felt more like the click of a lock finally turning in the right direction. Somewhere in Santa Barbara, their accounts would be buzzing with error messages, payments declined, invoices delayed. In my mother's inbox, an email was already waiting. Operational funds temporarily frozen pending ownership review. I imagined her reading it, confusion giving way to panic. Ryan pacing, shouting, calling me. My phone stayed on the table, face down, silent. I poured a glass of wine and leaned back against the couch, staring at the reflection of city lights on the window. I used to think revenge had to make noise, but sometimes all it takes is a single, deliberate click. Santa Barbara always looked like a postcard in December. The Carters' house sat at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac trimmed with lights that flickered unevenly, a plastic nativity scene glowing faintly on the lawn. Inside, Lydia rushed between the kitchen and dining room, her smile stretched too tight to stay in place. She straightened the napkins, adjusted the centerpiece, checked the oven, even though she knew the roast was fine. Pastor Green was the first to arrive, a kind man with a heavy voice who smelled faintly of cedarwood and aftershave. Lydia? This place looks lovely, he said warmly, handing her a poinsettia. Thank you, Pastor, she replied, voice slightly high. We wanted to keep it simple this year. Peaceful. Sabrina floated in behind him, wearing a red velvet dress that matched the wine in her hand. It's so calm this year, she said with a bright smile. So much lighter. Lydia's face softened. Yes, lighter. Ryan was quiet, sitting at the end of the table, phone face down but never out of reach. Every few minutes he'd flip it over, thumb tapping the screen, frown deepening. He scrolled through emails, swiping fast. No notifications, no confirmations, only one new message blinking in his inbox. Payment declined. He locked the screen and looked up. Did the payroll go through this morning? Lydia froze for half a second. I think so. Why? Because Ben texted. He said his check didn't clear. Probably just a system glitch. She said too quickly, wiping her hands on her apron. Banks are slow around the holidays, Ryan nodded. Not convinced. He poured himself wine. Sabrina reached over, brushing his arm. Relax. It's Christmas. Yeah, he muttered, eyes on his phone again. The front door opened and Richard walked in carrying firewood, face flushed from the cold. Everything all right in here? Perfect, Lydia said, forcing a laugh. Everything's perfect. She didn't mention the email that had come an hour earlier, subject line, operational funds temporarily frozen. Pending review. She'd deleted it immediately. Then emptied the trash folder, as if that could erase the problem. Outside, carolers' voices drifted down the street. Soft, cheerful, unbothered. Inside, the house felt too warm. Lydia dabbed at her forehead, murmuring to herself about the oven timer. Meanwhile, in Los Angeles, the city glowed in its own kind of winter light. My apartment smelled like cinnamon and wine. I'd lit 3 candles and turned on some jazz, something slow and smoky from an old vinyl I'd found at a thrift store. The sound filled the space like a heartbeat. I poured myself a glass of red and sank into the couch. From my window, the skyline stretched endlessly, glittering, with 1,000 lives that had nothing to do with mine. For the first time in years, I wasn't packing a bag, wasn't checking traffic on the 101, wasn't wondering whether I'd remembered the right wine for my mother. I just sat there breathing. This was the first Christmas I hadn't been invited home, and the first one that didn't feel like a punishment. The candles flickered in the reflection of the window, merging with the city lights outside. I thought about the dinner table in Santa Barbara. The polite laughter, the way they'd probably toast to new beginnings. Maybe Sabrina would raise her glass, saying something passive-aggressive about letting go of toxic energy. I smiled faintly. Let them have their peace. They'd bought it cheap. I reached for my phone out of habit, but there were no messages. None from Mom, none from Ryan. Just the quiet. It was strange how silence could feel like freedom when it used to feel like exile. The record skipped softly in the background, and I leaned my head against the couch cushion, closing my eyes. For a while, I just listened to the city. Cars, laughter, a siren in the distance. No shouting, no guilt, no obligation. Just life moving forward without me needing to chase it. Somewhere in Santa Barbara, Lydia was probably refreshing her email. I imagined her whispering to herself, "It's just a delay. It'll clear tomorrow." But it wouldn't. At some point, the bank would call or Daniel's paperwork would hit their inbox, and they'd realize the truth: the faucet had run dry. I swirled the wine in my glass, watching the liquid catch the candlelight. For years, I'd been their safety net, their invisible insurance policy. But tonight, as I looked out over the city, I realized how light it felt, not holding anyone up. This was the quiet they wanted. "This is the first Christmas," I said softly to the empty room where no one needs me. I raised my glass, the sound of it clinking against the edge of the table too small to matter. And I don't need them either. The music played on slow and unhurried. Outside, a neighbor's balcony had fake snow drifting down from a plastic machine, tiny white flakes catching the glow of the streetlights. I stood and walked closer to the window, watching them fall. They melted against the glass almost instantly. Somewhere far away, bells began to ring, the kind that echoed from a church you couldn't see. I closed my eyes and let the sound fade into the background. Peace, I thought, wasn't something anyone could give you. You had to take it back yourself. The morning after Christmas, Carter's roastery felt less like a cafe and more like a storm shelter. Phones rang non-stop. The espresso machine hissed in the background, ignored. Ryan stood behind the counter, his jaw tight, one hand gripping his phone, the other tapping nervously on the register. "Just a temporary issue, everyone," he said, forcing a smile toward the two baristas hovering nearby. "Bank systems get weird during the holidays. We'll have it sorted by tomorrow." His voice cracked on the last word. The shop manager, Ben, held out a printed invoice. The dairy supplier called again. "They said their last 3 deliveries haven't been paid for." Ryan snatched the paper, scanning the totals. His stomach dropped. "I'll handle it," he muttered, but his fingers were shaking when he opened his email. The message was at the top of his inbox, bold, official, impossible to ignore. "Notice of capital withdrawal and termination of financial guarantee from Madison Carter." The air around him seemed to thin. Sabrina walked out of the back room just as he finished reading. She was dressed like she'd been expecting a camera crew, not chaos. Tight blazer lipstick, too perfect for a workday. "What's wrong?" He didn't answer. He just turned the screen toward her. She stared. "What does that mean?" "It means she pulled out," he said quietly. Her eyes widened. "You said she didn't have control anymore. You said she was just an investor." Ryan slammed the laptop shut. "She owns 45%. That's control, Sabrina. She always had control." "Then fix it," she snapped. "Call her. Apologize." He laughed, a bitter sound. "You think Madison forgives? You don't know her like I do." Meanwhile, in the back office, Lydia sat at the desk clutching her rosary, her phone pressed to her ear. "Please, just process the payments manually," she whispered into the receiver. "We have customers, employees. This can't happen right now." The voice on the other end was calm, but firm. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Carter. The account is frozen pending review. You'll need authorization from all primary shareholders to proceed." Lydia hung up her hand, trembling. She didn't pray. She just stared at the family photo on the wall. Ryan in the center, Sabrina beside him, and her own smile bright and artificial. Madison wasn't in it. She'd cropped her out years ago. Her phone buzzed again. Madison's name. For a moment, Lydia hesitated, then pressed call. It rang once before a familiar, calm voice answered. "Mom, Madison." Lydia said, her tone caught between pleading and fury. "What are you doing? The cafe's in chaos. You can't just—" "I can," Madison said softly. "And I did. You're destroying your family." Madison exhaled, slow, controlled. "You can't destroy something that was never whole to begin with." There was a long silence. Lydia tried to fill it. "Your father is furious. Ryan's panicking. Do you feel good about this?" "No," Madison said. "But I feel free." Lydia's breath hitched. "You think freedom comes from hurting people? I think freedom comes from not letting people hurt you anymore." The line went dead. Ryan stormed into the office. "What did she say?" Lydia wiped her eyes quickly. "She's not coming back." Sabrina threw her hands up. "Great. Just great. Now what?" Ryan turned toward the window, voice low and venomous. "Now we fix this ourselves. She's not the only one who knows how to play hardball." By noon, he'd posted a long, self-righteous paragraph on Facebook. Some people don't know how to let go. Even when it's family. Not every act of generosity is pure, and some people use money as a leash. Sabrina shared it with a new caption. When women get too powerful, they forget kindness. Within hours, the post started to circulate. Friends, family, church members, it spread faster than he expected. Someone commented, "Isn't your sister the investor?" Another wrote, "This is about Madison, isn't it?" By evening, the local Santa Barbara Gazette had picked it up for their digital column, Family Business in Turmoil, after alleged financial dispute. In my apartment in Los Angeles, I scrolled through it all while eating leftover takeout straight from the container. The article used my name 3 times. They even dug up an old photo from a charity event. Me, in a black dress, smiling like I didn't know I'd one day be the villain of my own bloodline. I read Ryan's post again, then Sabrina's. My finger hovered over the screen for a long time. I didn't comment, didn't text, didn't call. Instead, I laughed once under my breath. I'd always believed silence meant surrender, that if you didn't defend yourself, you were letting them win. But watching them unravel publicly, I realized silence wasn't surrender, it was the fuse. They wanted noise. They wanted me to argue to justify. They wanted my energy. I wasn't giving it to them anymore. The phone buzzed again, a message from Olivia. "Are you seeing this?" "They're losing it online," I typed back. "Good, let people see who's really screaming." I set the phone down, took a sip of wine, and opened my laptop. Their panic was the sound I'd been waiting to hear for years, and it was louder than any argument I'd ever have to make. Daniel's office always smelled like leather and paper, like decisions that couldn't be undone. The blinds were half open, slicing the morning light into thin bars that cut across his desk. I sat opposite him, the sound of Los Angeles traffic faint beyond the glass. The door opened, and Angela Torres stepped in, clutching a thick binder to her chest. Her face was pale, her eyes darting between the two of us. "I don't know if I'm doing the right thing," she said quietly. Daniel gestured for her to sit. "You are," he said. "Now tell us everything." Angela hesitated before placing the binder on the desk. Ryan's been moving money from the cafe's business account into a separate one under the name Hale Consulting. It started in July. At first, I thought it was just another vendor, but the payments kept increasing. 5,000 here, 10 there, and there were no invoices, no receipts. She exhaled shakily. I confronted him once. He told me to stay in my lane, said Madison approved it. That's when I knew he was lying. Daniel nodded slowly, opening the binder. Rows of transactions lined each page. "You kept records, I keep everything she said, but I can't keep this secret anymore." I met her eyes. "You did the right thing, Angela." She gave a small, nervous smile. "I just thought you should know before the whole thing crashes. It already has." I said. Daniel closed the binder. "I'll file a report with the Financial Conduct Division this afternoon. Once this is submitted, it's out of your hands." Angela nodded, relief and fear fighting for space on her face. "Thank you." I didn't want to go down with them. After she left, Daniel turned to me. "You ready for the fallout?" I gave a half smile. "It's already happening. I just made sure there'd be a record of who caused it." That afternoon, the report went out, and within 48 hours, Carter's roastery was under review. Ryan received the notification first. The message hit his inbox like a warning siren. Notice of investigation, potential financial misconduct. By then, the cafe was half empty, employees whispering behind the counter. Lydia was pacing near the window, phone in hand, trying to call me again. Every attempt went straight to voicemail. "Madison's done this," Ryan muttered, slamming his phone down. "She's behind all of it." Lydia's hands trembled. "Maybe if we just talk to her." "She blocked you." Sabrina interrupted, arms crossed, eyes sharp. "She's not listening." "Then we make her listen." Ryan snapped. Sabrina's lip curled into a smile. "Or we make her look bad enough that she has to." That evening, Sabrina posted a story, black background, white text. Some people don't know when to stop, even when it means watching everything burn. I saw it, of course. Everyone did. But I didn't care. I was standing by the window in my office at Luxform, the sun setting behind the skyline. The light caught on the glass, washing everything in gold. Below, cars crawled down Wilshire like a slow-moving artery. I pressed a hand against the window, feeling the faint vibration of the city's pulse. I didn't feel triumphant, just still. I wasn't the one breaking anything. I was just done fixing it. That night, the Santa Barbara Times ran the story, "Local Cafe Carter's Roastery Under Financial Investigation." The headline was sterile, but the subtext was brutal. It mentioned misappropriation of funds, potential fraud, and internal family conflict among ownership. My name was in the second paragraph. My phone lit up with messages. Olivia. "You okay, Evelyn? My boss." "We'll handle PR if needed." Even an old college acquaintance I hadn't spoken to in years messaged saw the article. "Family stuff's the worst." I turned the phone face down on my desk. It buzzed again. "Ryan." I let it ring 3 times before I answered. His voice came through sharp, brittle. "You happy now?" I leaned back in my chair. "Excuse me, you've destroyed everything, Maddie. Mom's crying, the staff's quitting, the cafe's under investigation. You really couldn't wait to see me fail, huh?" "I didn't make you fail," I said calmly. "You did that all by yourself. You always think you're better than us." "No." I cut in. "I just stopped pretending I wasn't." There was silence on the other end, followed by the sound of him exhaling hard. "You're unbelievable." "I know," I said, and hung up. I stared at my reflection in the dark screen of my computer, the faint glow of the city behind me. My face looked different somehow, not colder, not angrier, just unburdened. The next morning, Sabrina's name trended locally on social media. One of her sponsors, a wellness brand, announced they were reevaluating partnerships in light of ongoing controversy. She deleted her story within the hour. By afternoon, the cafe's doors were locked. Closed for inventory review, the sign read, though everyone knew it wasn't about inventory. The messages from family stopped. The noise quieted. That evening, I opened my laptop and logged into LinkedIn. The cursor blinked at me from the status box waiting. I typed, "No one can make you feel small once you've learned to stand tall." I hit post. Within an hour, the comments poured in. Women I'd never met wrote things like, "I needed this today," and "You have no idea how much this resonates." Colleagues shared it, adding their own stories of family and boundaries. I scrolled through them, reading quietly. Every word was a small reminder that I wasn't alone, that silence didn't mean isolation. It meant strength. By midnight, the post had over 2,000 reactions. My inbox filled with messages from women who'd been called ungrateful cold. Too independent, too much. I smiled, closing my laptop. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like the black sheep. I felt like the one who finally stopped walking back into the fire. The first week of January arrived gray and heavy, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones and stays there. At Carter's Roastery, the morning began like any other. Steam hissing doors, unlocking the smell of roasted beans floating into the air. But something felt different. The regulars didn't linger. The staff spoke in whispers. Ryan was behind the counter when the bell above the door rang. 3 people stepped inside. 2 men in dark suits and a woman holding a clipboard. The one in front showed his badge. "Detective Lewis, Santa Barbara Financial Crimes Division," he said calmly. "We're here to review your financial records and tax filings for Carter's Roastery." Ryan's throat went dry. "There must be a mistake," he stammered. "It's just some misunderstanding." Lewis's tone didn't change. "Then this won't take long." The air thickened. Lydia came out from the back, her face, pale eyes darting between them. "Officers. Please, can we handle this privately?" "My son, he's just under stress." Lewis looked at her kindly but firmly. "Ma'am, this is standard procedure. We'll need access to all business records, digital and physical. If you could direct us to your office." Her hands trembled as she gestured toward the back hallway. Ryan followed them. Voice cracking. "I have nothing to hide," he said. Even as his palms sweated. Outside, the scene was already gathering attention. Pastor Green stood near the curb speaking quietly to a local reporter. "The Carter family's been part of this community for decades," he said. "It's sad to see them going through all this." His tone carried a mixture of sympathy and distance. The way people talk when they're already stepping away from a sinking ship. Back inside, Lydia sat at one of the tables staring blankly ahead while the investigators opened file drawers and carried out boxes of receipts. The sound of paper shuffling filled the silence like static. Ryan paced near the espresso bar. "This is ridiculous," he muttered. "Angela set me up. She's the one who kept the books." Lydia looked up slowly. "Ryan, please, don't make this worse." But he was already dialing his phone. It rang once before going to voicemail. He cursed under his breath. "She's ignoring me. Who, Lydia asked. Madison, he snapped. Who else? In another corner, Sabrina sat, rigid arms folded. You really think you can blame her for this? She said quietly. You're the one who kept transferring money. Ryan turned, eyes blazing. You don't understand business. You never have. I understand lies, she said, standing, and I'm done living in one. She grabbed her purse and walked out. The bell over the door jingled once, then the silence swallowed it whole. Ryan's face twisted, half anger, half disbelief. Unbelievable, he muttered. Everyone's so quick to abandon ship. Lydia pressed her hands to her temples. Stop it, both of you. Just stop, her voice cracked. We can fix this, Ryan. We always fix things. Richard appeared from the hallway, then his expression unreadable. He didn't speak. He just stood there watching the investigators move around their cafe, lifting boxes, marking evidence bags. Say something, Lydia whispered to him. He shook his head slowly. There's nothing to say. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away, I was walking Emily to school. The morning was crisp, the sky pale blue. She held my hand tightly, her backpack bouncing with every step. My phone buzzed again and again. Texts, calls, notifications, news alerts. Local cafe under investigation for financial misconduct. I glanced at the screen once, then locked it. Emily looked up at me, her small face serious. Mom, are you okay? I'm perfect, I said, squeezing her hand. Let's get you to class. We reached the gate and she ran off toward her friends, her laughter echoing behind her. I stood there for a moment watching her go before turning back toward the car. I slid behind the wheel, took a breath, and finally let my voice fill the silence. Not everyone deserves to be saved, I said softly, even if they share your last name. Back in Santa Barbara, Ryan's meltdown was reaching its peak. He stormed into the storage room, knocking over a stack of boxes. She's ruined us, he shouted. One of the baristas peeked in, wide-eyed. Mr. Carter, should we close early? Ryan froze. For the first time, he seemed small. Yeah, he muttered. Close up. By noon, the inspectors had finished their sweep. Detective Lewis handed over a copy of the report summary. You'll be hearing from our office soon, he said. In the meantime, it's best to suspend operations until this is resolved. Lydia's lips trembled. Suspend. He nodded once, not unkindly, temporarily. When they left, Lydia stood in the doorway, watching them disappear into the sunlight. The sign that had once welcomed customers now looked faded. Ryan came up behind her holding a piece of paper. The official notice from the city. His voice was flat when he read it aloud. Closed for technical review. The words sounded sterile, harmless, but everyone in the room knew what they meant. That evening, as I drove home through Los Angeles traffic, the radio crackled to life with a local news segment. Carter's Roastery, a family-owned coffee shop in Santa Barbara, has temporarily closed amid an ongoing financial investigation. No formal charges have been filed, but sources indicate discrepancies in financial reporting. I kept my eyes on this road, one hand resting loosely on the wheel. The city lights blurred ahead of me. The reporter's voice faded into static, replaced by a soft piano commercial for something forgettable. I didn't smile. I didn't frown. It was just quiet. At the next red light, I looked out the window. A family crossed the street, the mother holding her son's hand, both laughing under the glow of the street lamps. Just for now, I whispered to myself the words barely audible. Then forever. The light turned green. I pressed the gas, and the city swallowed the sound. The ballroom lights shimmered like gold against glass. I stood under them, a small dot on a big stage, staring out at a few hundred faces. Women in sharp suits, some scribbling notes, some watching me. The way I used to watch people who looked like they had everything figured out. The microphone caught the tremor in my breath before I steadied it. When I was younger, I thought love was the same thing as loyalty. I thought saying yes meant being good. And I thought that if I just kept showing up for the people who didn't show up for me one day, they'd see me as enough. The crowd went silent, not out of pity, but recognition. I could feel it, but the truth is, I continued. Sometimes you have to leave the table to remind them what the meal was worth. Sometimes the only way to save yourself is to stop saving everyone else. The silence deepened. Then one woman in the front row started clapping. It spread, rolling through the room until the sound filled every corner. When the applause faded, I smiled. Small, quiet, genuine. Thank you, I said. and meant it. Afterward, backstage, I sat on a velvet chair, the adrenaline still buzzing under my skin. My phone buzzed in my bag. It was Daniel. He signed the statement. Full admission of fund misuse. The case is closed. For a moment, I didn't breathe. Not out of shock. Just release. The kind of release that doesn't make you lighter, just empty enough to let something new fit inside. I walked over to the window, pushed the heavy curtain aside, and looked down at Manhattan. The city glowed beneath me, alive and restless. Cars, people, lives, each one chasing something they thought they deserved. I poured a glass of wine from the minibar, took a sip, and let the warmth slide through me. Pulling back the money hadn't freed me. Pulling back my guilt had. Somewhere in Santa Barbara, the cafe sat shuttered. The sign faded under the salt air. My family would be sitting around their kitchen table, smaller now, quieter. I didn't need to be there to know how it looked. That night, Pastor Green stopped by their house. Lydia had baked a pie she didn't touch. Her hands trembling slightly as she poured coffee, Richard sat by the window with the paper pretending to read. The pastor cleared his throat gently. I spoke with the legal office, he said. The investigation's over. No charges will be filed. Madison chose not to pursue civil action. Lydia's head lifted. So that's it. It's over. He gave her a kind smile. Legally, yes. But reputation, that's not something anyone can buy back. The words landed like stones. She nodded slowly, eyes glistening. I never wanted this. I know, Pastor Green said softly, but sometimes the things we ignore have a way of demanding attention later. Richard folded the newspaper in his lap, his voice low. It's not right. Family doesn't take family to court. She didn't, the pastor reminded him gently. That's the only reason you're not in one. The clock ticked loud in the stillness. When he left, Lydia stayed seated at the table staring at the cooling pie. She whispered almost to herself, I thought money fixed things. Richard didn't answer. The sound of his breathing filled the space where his pride used to live. Meanwhile, in my hotel room, I stood barefoot near the window, watching the yellow cabs snake through the streets below. The reflection of the city flickered in my glass of wine. I whispered into the silence. Justice doesn't need a courtroom. It just needs time. The glass clinked softly as I set it down on the nightstand. Outside, the wind rattled faintly against the window. I turned off the light, letting the city's glow spill across the room. And for the first time in months, I didn't dream about them at all. The rain had been falling since dawn, the kind that wasn't dramatic, just steady whispering against the windows, like a lullaby that wouldn't end. I was halfway through making coffee when the doorbell rang. Through the peephole, I saw a mail carrier holding a small bundle of envelopes. One of them larger and cream-colored, handwritten. When I opened the door, he smiled faintly. Morning, Ms. Carter. Thought I'd drop this off myself. It looked important. Thank you, I said, taking it carefully. The handwriting was familiar. Elegant, a little shaky. From Mom. I stood there for a moment staring at it. The sound of the rain filled the silence. Emily peeked around the corner, her small face curious. Who's it from? I smiled faintly. Just someone I used to know very well. She giggled, distracted by the smell of pancakes on the stove, and disappeared again. I walked to the couch and sat down, the envelope soft between my fingers. For a second I thought about setting it aside, but curiosity, no closure, was heavier than hesitation. I tore it open. The first line made me stop breathing. You always made me feel small because you were so strong. But now I understand. It wasn't your fault. The words blurred for a second. I blinked hard and kept reading. We taught you silence. Then we hated you for being silent. I thought I was protecting your brother, but I see now I was protecting my own guilt. I don't know if forgiveness matters to you anymore, but I want you to know. I see it now. You were never trying to win. You were trying to belong. I'm sorry. It wasn't long, barely half a page, but I read it 3 times, each one slower than the last. I didn't cry, not really, but something inside me shifted like a door clicking open after being jammed for too long. I folded the letter neatly and set it beside the framed photo on the shelf. The one where I was half out of the picture. For the first time, I didn't want to throw it away. Behind me, Emily's footsteps pattered across the hardwood. Mom, she said, tugging my sleeve. Where's my Christmas tree? It's right here, I said, pointing to the small artificial tree in the corner. The lights were still up, glowing faintly in the rainy light. She frowned. No, my new one. The one I'm decorating for next year. You said I could pick who comes to our Christmas dinner. Her words hit soft but deep. I smiled. That's right, sweetheart. You can pick whoever you want. Even Miss Olivia, she asked, eyes wide. Especially Miss Olivia. She grinned and ran off again, humming to herself. That night, after she'd gone to bed, I set the table for two, a habit I hadn't been able to let go of. Just me and the quiet. The rain had stopped, leaving the city damp and reflective. I lit a single candle and poured a glass of wine, not for celebration, but for peace. I opened my laptop, typed out a short email to Daniel. Thank you for helping me protect my boundaries. It wasn't just about the law, it was about my sanity. I hovered over send for a moment, then clicked. The inbox was quiet again, and I sat there, the candle flame dancing in the reflection of the window. Sometimes it amazed me how peace could sound so much like loneliness, and yet not hurt anymore. A week later, I drove downtown to a small office near the financial district. The space was half empty, just me and a woman from the local community foundation. She handed me a folder and smiled. Everything's approved. Carter. Once you sign here, the fund becomes official. I signed without hesitation. Carter's Second Chance Fund. Supporting women in business recovery. It wasn't about legacy. It wasn't even about redemption. It was about redirecting something that had once been poisoned. Driving home, I passed the pier. The water shimmered under the early evening sun, soft and gold. For the first time in years, I didn't think about what I'd lost. I thought about what I was finally choosing. I wasn't saving my family anymore. I was saving the part of me that used to think I had to. The drive up the coast felt different this time. Lighter, somehow. The same stretch of Highway 101 that once carried me home, now only carried me forward. Emily hummed softly in the back seat, twisting the ribbon on one of the small presents she'd wrapped herself. Do you think Grandma would like the candle I made? She asked. She would, I said, even if she doesn't know it's from you. The air smelled faintly of salt and pine from the Christmas stands along the road. The town of Santa Barbara shimmered under strings of white lights as we pulled into Main Street. Every window glowed with decorations. Wreaths, garlands, people bundled up against a winter that barely existed. When I stopped at the light near the old cafe, my breath caught without warning. Carter's roastery was gone. The awning had been replaced, the familiar brown sign painted over. In its place, navy letters gleamed, Blue Harbor Cafe. The windows looked cleaner, brighter. There were new tables, new people inside, laughter spilling out into the street. For a long moment, I just sat there watching strangers fill the space that once belonged to everything I tried to hold together. They used to say I took all the light out of the room, but the truth was I just learned how to build my own lamp. Across the street, a figure stood by the corner lamppost. Lydia. My mother. She was thinner than I remembered, wrapped in an old gray coat, her hair tucked into a knitted hat. She wasn't smiling, but there was something gentler in her face, something that hadn't been there before. For a second, neither of us moved. The world seemed to slow. The hum of cars, the flicker of Christmas lights. Even the soft voice of Bing Crosby floating out from the cafe's speakers. Then she lifted her eyes, found mine, across the street. I didn't wave. I didn't cry. I just nodded once, small but steady. She blinked, as if startled, then gave a faint nod back. No words, no apology, just acknowledgement. The light turned green. I pressed my foot on the gas and drove on. Mom. Emily's voice piped up from the back seat. Are Grandma and Grandpa coming this year? Her question came like a snowflake and light, but it landed heavy. I glanced at her in the mirror. No, sweetheart, I said softly. It's just us. She thought about it for a moment, then smiled. That's okay. We're enough. The radio crackled as if agreeing, and a soft melody filled the car. Silent night, low and clear. I turned the volume up just enough to let it linger. Outside the town blurred past. The bakery I used to visit as a child, the church my mother still attended every Sunday, the hill that overlooked the ocean. Everything familiar, everything changed. As we passed the pier, the sky opened into a soft, fading gold. I rolled down the window a little, letting the wind rush in. It carried the faint sound of seagulls' laughter and waves crashing against the rocks. Emily leaned forward. Can we get cocoa when we get home? Of course, I said. Extra marshmallows. She grinned. You always know. I smiled to myself, my hands steady on the wheel. For years I thought justice meant making them see what they'd done. But standing here, driving through the place that once held all my pain, I realized justice wasn't about being right. It was about being free. They had panicked, begged, tried to rewrite the story. But by the time they understood the cost, the price of what they'd taken, it was too late. Because fairness isn't about revenge, it's about rescue, and sometimes the person you have to save is yourself. The road curved and the town disappeared behind us. Ahead, the city lights began to twinkle again, waiting to fold us back into the life we'd built from scratch. I reached over, turned the radio down, and said quietly, "Merry Christmas, kiddo. Merry Christmas." "Mom," she replied, yawning. Her head tilted against the window as she drifted to sleep, the reflection of the passing lights dancing across her face. And in that moment, everything. The noise, the blame, the ache, finally settled into silence. If you've ever been uninvited from your own table, remember this. Sometimes the peace you're searching for isn't in being welcomed back. It's in building your own table and realizing you never needed permission to sit there. So stay, breathe, tell your story, because somewhere out there, someone else needs to hear it to believe that they too can start again.